Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Safety and Risk Success podcast. I'm Christian Harris. My guests today are Tony Lewis and Richard Short. And of course, we're in this massive coronavirus pandemic situation where the benefits of the knowledge of EHOs such as these two guys are really profound and important. Although interestingly, as they'll tell us, the UK government hasn't been as quick or as keen as other governments have to involve environmental health professionals in the response to the pandemic.
I'm Tony Lewis. I'm currently Associate Professor at the Royal Agricultural University, at least for part of my working week. For the other part of my working week, I do stuff for Middlesex University, teaching occupational health and safety, and pretty much anything that they ask me to do. And I also do occasionally shifts for test and trace. So leading into the COVID stuff. I mean, my background is I'm an environmental health officer. And I've been in environmental health for, looking at 40 years now, for heaven's sakes. And where's it all gone? Who knows? But it seems to have just flown by in an instant. And yet, when I look back, I think, well, how did I get from starting at Amber Valley Borough Council in Derbyshire and doing, all the basics that go with environmental health, so all of the housing inspections and food inspections and health and safety visits, officers' shops, Railway Premises Act, as it was back in those days, and doing all of that to ending up, and certainly, up to, I had 17 years up until 2 years ago working for the Chartered Institute of Environmental Health, variously as head of education, head of policy, head of education and policy. I ended up doing a lot with them, and that meant that in the position I was in and having to represent my professional colleagues and environmental health as a profession, it was inevitable that I would end up talking to politicians, senior civil servants, not only in the UK, but also overseas, into the European Union, obviously, but, into other sovereign governments as well. But invariably, those conversations would always be about the same thing, trying to get the best that you could get for environmental health and for environmental health professionals.
Before I come to the question, Christian, I think it's important to remember, myself and Tony, we started at the same point. We've gone into completely different directions, but the common thread with us both is that we're both environmental health officers.
Yep.
And I'll lead up to the outbreaks and the cruise ships and all that sort of thing, I promise you. But I've got to pick up the thread that Tony has left and run with it, because it's incredibly important what's being said there. I started humbly at Wigan Metropolitan Borough Council way back when. I've been in practice for 33 years. And I moved away from public sector, third sector, and I've gone into private consultancy. I did some work with consultants in private practice. My current job now, I've leapfrogged the cruise ships, but my current job now is and this is down to me being an environmental health officer. I'm Vice President for Health and Security for Northern Europe for a large hotel group. And Northern Europe, in the context that I'm in now, my patch, and I said this in a recent social media post, my patch has grown from a small corner of a metropolitan borough, and now it goes from the UK literally to Vladivostok. I've got a lot under my wing, as it were. Now the journey to get to that is an environmental health journey. The common thread is that whatever my association is, whether it's with a client as a consultant, or as an employee with a business, or indeed as an officer for a local authority, my first interest is environmental health, bar none, bar nothing else. And I think that singles out, or it gives that that clear definition of the professional within the profession.
Mm-hmm.
There are lots and lots of people that have an interest in environmental health, that understand environmental health, but it's the professional that's at the heart of it. And that's I think, and I hope I'm speaking for yourself as well, Tony, that
Absolutely.
it's people like me and Tony and many, many hundreds, thousands of others like us that just have it, break us in two, and we've got environmental health written as like a sticker wrong. Now, it's I'll bring in the cruise ships here because it does have an environmental health angle. The first cruise ship I was ever brought onto, and this is during my days in private consultancy, they brought me on. I mean, first of all, because I was British, and I thought, oh yeah, that makes me quite, I'll wrap myself up in the Union Jack, but it wasn't actually that. It was actually a Dutch organisation that contacted the British authorities, and they were directed towards environmental health because this was an outbreak of a of a gastrointestinal illness. They didn't know it was foodborne at the time, but they needed somebody on to advise them, to consult with them, to deal with the situation that had that broad base of knowledge, not just with food hygiene, important though it is, not just with infection control and infectious disease, important though it is, and indeed not just to do with the technical side of things, with the technical services on ships, like the ventilation systems, the heating systems, the desalination systems. And the only subject, the only profession that can bring all those things together is environmental health.
Yeah.
Because I went on board this ship, and I'm desperately trying not to name names because I know this is going public, but I was on board this ship. And looking at the epidemiology, I knew it wasn't going to be viral. There was a point source there. I knew it wasn't going to have anything to do with the services on the ship. And by services, I mean the heating, the ventilation, the life support mechanisms on the ship. And so I drilled down on the fact that it was, and it turned out to be the case, a salmonella outbreak. And there were faults with, and that's the only way to describe it, I'm not going to sugarcoat this, there were faults with the way the food was prepared.
I mean, I've done a lot of TV over the last 3 to 4 years, a lot of TV. And at one point I seemed to be along with Lisa Ackley in the profession, the two people that TV companies would tend to go to. TV is always interesting to do, and live TV particularly is interesting to do, but it's always a challenge. And the challenge is the live TV is nerve-wracking, but it's over and done, and out you walk. But TV that is being recorded for dispatching a program, pardon the pun, it takes, I mean, I was involved with something that was like filming for about 3.5 hours to end up with probably what, 2-3 minutes, something like that, of screen time in a 28-minute show. And that is, so you invest a lot, and you invest a lot in the hope of conveying what you want to convey, but you're never certain that what you want to convey won't end up on the cutting room floor, or, and which does happen from time to time, what you've said ends up being slightly recut, and you lose the sense, or indeed a fresh sense is conveyed. So it's always challenging to do. I mean, the program that ended up going out, I thought was quite good. It was balanced.
How do we feel? You know, we as the UK have dealt with the COVID pandemic so far. I don't know who wants to start on that one.
I'll go first, Tony.
Go on, Richard.
We're going to agree on this bit. Badly. It started so badly. 12th of March was when the wheels came off, because that's when the abandoned contact tracing. Anybody that knows anything about looking at particularly an airborne aerosol spread virus. And we knew pretty early on this was not just droplets, not just the coughing and sneezing, but aerosol, which you breathe out.
Yeah.
Anybody that knows anything about this knows that contact tracing, it really is the be all and end all. And even in the SPIAM procedures that the government uses, they talk about, we have a bit of a giggle about the acronym, but it's the FFH, not FFS. It's the FFH that they use. And it literally stands for the first few hundred. And it's the first few hundred cases that you get that you can contact trace actually sets the scene for the entire outbreak. Yes. And that's what was abandoned from the beginning. Yes. And I know, Tony, you were like, what are they doing? Yeah. And I was, what are they doing? And I really don't understand why they did it.
Yeah.
And I was on this one.
I just think that there were siren voices all over the place at the start, and the government had diverging opinions being expressed, and the government were desperate to try and keep the lid on things and to try and make sure that not only was public health reasonably protected, but that the economy was protected as well. And I think there was some siren voices that were talking about the potential for herd immunity and all of the things that went with that. And you'll recall that phrase being used way back last March. And the problem that you got was, herd immunity and a coronavirus is extremely elusive with a coronavirus. And the additional problem that we got was even the earliest research that had been done in China and labs around the world on the very first samples was showing that the way that the human body acquires immunity and how long that immunity would last counted against the ability to produce herd immunity. And I think the government listened to the wrong advisors, and we ended up going down rabbit holes that we should never have gone down.
Right, this is where there may be some divergence between myself and Tony. Although, no, I would agree. The environmental health angle. My very first job, literally my very first job, when I qualified, I trained in Wigan, and my first qualified EHO post was in Bolton, neighbouring authority. Day one, I had a pile of contact tracing cards put on my desk to say, right, welcome to Bolton Borough Council. You've got a hepatitis A outbreak to deal with. And it was a baptism of fire. And I really cut my teeth on things like contact tracing. But it's exactly how Tony described. You literally have these names and addresses or phone numbers. And as the saying goes, you contact them. You get as much information as you can. You have a template of information that you must get, and some information that would be desirable to get, and that forms the basis of controls going on from that point. What do you do with that information? And that again is where the environmental health expertise comes into play. Because it's not just good enough to say, right, I want answers to these questions. You've got to know what to do with those answers. Yeah. And that's again where the environmental health expertise comes in, which I've got to say, and I've said this all the way through this outbreak, we haven't been represented and I'm going to say this it's going to sound very conceited, but we are, as a profession, the absolute experts when it comes to field epidemiology. We all did this, as part of our training, and most of us have done this in practice, in anger, as it were.
Yeah.
Where I'm going to start to diverge from Tony is because this whole the phrase herd immunity has become a phrase to ignore. It's something that we really shouldn't be talking about when you don't know what you're dealing with. It's all you've got because you've got this disease that very little about. What we did know is that certain people were more vulnerable than others, and quite quickly it became clear that the elderly population, or those with in infection control terms, We call them the yoppies. Yeah? It's the young, the old, the pregnant, and the immunocompromised. And it's these vulnerable groups that we knew were going to be more at risk. But we knew from an early stage that young and healthy adults, and particularly children, weren't particularly at risk. So we knew who needed protecting, and we knew who were probably, sadly, were probably going to get coronavirus, but they weren't going to have too ill effects from it. And I think where and this is where myself and Tony do definitely diverge, is that my feeling is that for a disease that isn't going to be serious in the vast majority of the population, if all you've got is herd immunity, this is before vaccinations were even being talked about, then you need to protect the most vulnerable. We're going to move slightly off topic here, but again, it's entirely relevant to what we're talking about here, is that and it must be the past 20, 25 years, there's been this slow, gradual dismantling of environmental health departments in local authorities. In that it was a fairly fixed structure. Every local authority, and I think every local authority, had a distinct director-led environmental health department. That was the chief environmental health officer. And everything came down from that. It was a pyramid to the chief environmental health officer. Now it's not the case. You have environmental health departments, but they would report to different departments. They'd be fragmented. You don't get that coherence, and I think that's been to the detriment of what's been going on with this pandemic. There's been no go-to person. That normally, in the old days, let's say, that would be the chief environmental health officer.
And you know, the eat out to help out stuff was great intentions in terms of boosting the hospitality industry post the first wave. But all we ended up doing was sowing the seeds of the second. And I'm
going to disagree with that.
I know you would disagree with me on that one. And I'm not blaming the hospitality industry here at all. You know, they dealt with the cards that they were dealt with, and that's the issue. The problem that we got was that the moment that you put a live infection into places where large numbers of people gather together with minimal levels of ventilation and ultimately control, and people would do the best they reasonably could. You know, we'd have one-way systems going through pubs and restaurants and eating houses and all that, but it's the very numbers that we got in there. And yes, there would be the 2 meter separation, and I couldn't criticize that, but you got an airborne aerosol. Yeah. And
now I'll explain why. I'm sorry, Christian. I'm going to disagree, but then agree with Tony.
That's okay. It's all good. It's insightful stuff on all sides.
Clearly, I work in the hospitality industry, and yes, I can be accused of bias in favour of my industry. But what being in the hospitality industry also does means I'm very, very close to the controls and what's going on. Now, the eat out to help out, yes, of course, it was brilliant from a business point of view, and you could argue that we escaped double dip recession because we had that period of economic activity, which gives us the resources to be able to fight the coronavirus. That's on the economic argument. However, when you see the lengths that some pubs, restaurants, hotels have gone to prevent the spread of infection, it does have an effect. And if you're going to have eat out to help, have it in August, yeah, because the long days of daylight, the UV can denature a virus very, very quickly. You do have doors and windows open, so you do have the ventilation going on. Now, where the hospitality industry failed is where because it's all very well for the likes of Wetherspoons or big hotel chains. They've got the resources to put controls in place, but that wasn't universally the case. And it wasn't universally the case that when they did have the controls in place, that they were properly monitored. Now, speaking for myself, the group I'm employed by, we have a set of standards. I know because I wrote them. These are the protocols that we put in place in the hotels, and they were independently audited. you know, and that's where they're going to the top of this interview. That's why I take very seriously that, yes, I work in hospitality, yes, I work for hotels, but my first priority is environmental health. So if there was a hotel that failed its audit, then they wouldn't get the accreditation, and they would get me on like a ton of bricks, you know, to be able to sort out their issues. And we only have to see a study that was done by Manchester Evening News, where they went round a number of pubs, as it was, to talk about the NHS test and trace. And 8 out of 10 failed. 8 out of 10 took it as lip service, and that's simply not good enough. If you go into open, and I'm going to point an accusing finger at some of the local authorities here as well, because we have our environmental health colleagues working for in local authorities. The level of enforcement, frankly, should have been better, because when a journalist can find 8 out of 10 pubs failing, surely our environmental health colleagues in local authorities should be finding that as well. Now, I'm not pointing the finger at individual officers, but I am pointing the finger at perhaps the management of enforcement in some local authorities, which is, we can take joint responsibility. It's in industry, yes, there are elements where we've failed, but also enforcement, there are elements where we've failed.
And the one thing that EHOs have never been good at, and that is, you know, shouting and banging the tables and building a case for ourselves. We're very, very good at managing problems. And one of those problems that we consistently manage is when those in senior positions in local authorities come along and ask for cuts, we deliver it.
Yeah.
We're very good at managing those kinds of problems. And yet when there are occasions when, frankly, we should sit there and say, no, ye shall not pass, you know, and we're not good at that. And I think that's part of the issues, that we've ended up salami slicing so much resource away, that when you end up with what we've had for the last year, it's become nigh on impossible. I don't necessarily think it's all down to hard cash. Okay, we'd all could do with more, and frankly, if we had a lot more, we'd go out and recruit more people. Great, but the lead-in time to do that recruitment is now so long. You know, if there's not the people out there waiting to be employed, so you've got to grow them. You've got to grow them. Sorry, Richard.
No, I just want to follow on what you're saying. I'm just going to do another shout out, because we aren't good at this, Tony. So let's do it now. I'm going to do a shout out for environmental health because of our omnipresence. Yes, we're hygiene trained, we're safety trained, we're legally trained.
Yeah.
We've got a whole raft of training, and now, rather insultingly, and I take it as an insult, our profession has been called the jack of all trades, master of none. I've never accepted that.
Yeah.
I prefer to call ourselves the professional polymath, because we can do anything, basically. We can, and it was a bit of advice I got in when I first started in Bolton, before the pile of contact tracing ended on my desk, and I was sat down with what was then my boss, a wonderful man, John Baines. I'll name names. John Baines, his name was, a wonderful principal environmental health officer for food safety in Bolton. And he sat me down and he says, Richard, one thing you've got to remember coming into this job is that when somebody comes to that desk wanting some help, they've probably been through every other council department have been let down. We can't let them down because we're their last resort. And I've always carried that with me. And even now, working in the hotel group, I have this overwhelming urge when somebody asks me a question, I have to answer it, or I've got to find somebody to answer it. And that comes from that conversation I had in 1992 with John Baines. And he was absolutely right.
We are problem solvers.
Yeah.
We are a profession of problem solvers.
And because of the training we've got in all various different disciplines, we can pull these things together and help people solve those problems. Now, with this salami slicing, as you say, Tony, and I've seen it as well in local authority, in my own, where I live now, I've seen this happening, it's not so much specialisation, but you have certain jobs need doing. And it's easy to train somebody to do, for example, a food hygiene inspection. It's easy to train somebody to go and take some noise measurements. It's easy to train somebody to look to see if there's any tripping hazards in the workplace. What it's not easy to do is to get the one person that can do all of that and apply professional judgment at the same time. That's the environmental health practitioner. And it was very stark. And I'm afraid I was very blunt with some people when I saw this in social media, when Test and Trace was being set up, and this is what you're doing part-time now, periodically now, isn't it? Where I could see people in social media saying, well, I've got a qualification in whatever it is. Why can't I do it? And I was direct with them and says, because you're not an environmental health officer. This isn't food hygiene. This isn't health and safety. You know, this is infection control.
Yeah.
It may be different to it's bread and butter to us.
Yeah, yes. We have not been used as effectively as we might have been.
Yeah.
And there's a big petition for a minister for hospitality, isn't there? Perhaps we should be starting one for an EHO minister.
Well, no, you're absolutely right. No, you've hit the nail on the head, because that is, we've never had a chief environmental health officer in England, chief environmental health officer in Wales, absolutely, and it's ditto for Northern Ireland, but not for England. Why not? And the argument that's consistently been there was, well, which government department would we sit in? Because we do some food, and we do health and safety, and we do housing, and we do environmental protection. Which government department would we sit in? And my argument is, frankly, I don't care. I really don't care. But if the Welsh can do it, if the Irish can do it, why can't we?
Well, it's funny you should say that, Tony, because I wrote an article for our professional journal, must be a couple of years ago now, calling for a Secretary of State for Environmental Health.
Yeah.
You know, and I don't know how it could work, you know, but because in a regulatory form, barring, you know, the likes of New Zealand, Australia, what have you, environmental health in the way we do it in the UK isn't done anywhere else. And it was interesting that the group I work for is based in France, and I was talking to one of my French colleagues, and he said to me, he says, oh, we don't do health and safety in France. And I said, well, I think you do. I said, well, just in a different way. Yeah, it's all about the regulatory framework.
Yeah. Yeah.
And part of the reason why I'm doing the job I'm doing now, and it is literally from UK to Vladivostok, is because we've just been through quite a restructure within the group. And across the whole of the region, it's sort of bringing numbers of regions together into one big region. And there isn't an equivalent of me anywhere else in the whole of Northern Europe, bearing in mind that includes Russia and beyond. So, and I think that speaks volumes. You know, they needed somebody that could touch all these disciplines, and you know, I might sound very big-headed about it, but that person was me.
Absolutely right.
If there was another me somewhere, then that could have been that person.
Absolutely right.